Hello, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual event with Emma Brodie and Katherine Heiny to discuss songs in Ursa Major. Emma Brodie has worked in book publishing for a decade, most recently as an executive editor at Little Brown's Voracious imprint. She graduated from the Johns Hopkins University Writing Seminars program and is a longtime contributor to HuffPost and a faculty member at Catapult. She currently lives in Brooklyn with her husband and their dog, Freddie Mercury. Katherine Heiny is the author of Standard Deviation, Single, Carefree, Mellow, and Early Morning Riser. Her short fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and many other magazines. She lives in Bethesda, Maryland, with her husband and children, and is a former resident of London, The Hague, Boyne City, Michigan. Throughout tonight's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order copies of Songs in Ursa Major by pressing the green button below. And that green button also takes you to our shop site where you can buy Katherine's books as well. We appreciate each and every order, of course, and we also appreciate the donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hi, Emmy.
Hi.
My name is Katherine Heiny, and I'm here to talk to Emma Brodie about her novel, Songs in Ursa Major. And I'm so excited to do that because it's a great, great novel. It's about Jane Quinn, a small town singer-songwriter who steps in to replace folk legend Jesse Reed at a local folk festival when he's unable to perform. Her cover of his hit song propels her into the spotlight, as well as into the orbit of Reed. Jesse and Jane fall in love, tour together, and their stars continue to rise until she learns a secret from his past. This book was reviewed yesterday in the LA Times, and normally when I read a novel that gets a review like this, I get jealous and I have to go to bed early, but because it was so well-deserved and such a rave review, I just want to do a quick quote from it saying, Brodie works with big themes: individuation, mental illness, legacy, self-destruction, and redemption, but her touch is lighter than an onshore breeze. So you can agree with me and the LA Times that you're in for a treat with this book. So Emma, will you maybe give us a little taste of it?
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much to Books and Books, and thank you, Katherine, for doing this with me. I'm just going to read the opening of the book. If you're not convinced yet, hopefully this will ensnare your interest, and we'll just take it from there. So I'm going to attempt to hold it up the whole time. I don't have a lot of upper body strength, so if my vision sags, that's why. The year of Zoom has not cured me of that. But yes, without further ado. Island Folk Fest, Saturday, July 26, 1969. As a stagehand cleared the dismantled pieces of Flower Moon's set, the last shred of daylight formed a golden curve around the symbol. It winked at the crowd, then the red sun slipped into the sea. In the gathering dust, the platform shimmered like an enamel shell, reverberating with the audience's anticipation. Any minute now, Jesse Reed would go on. Curtis Wilkes stood about 30 feet from the platform with the rest of the press. There was Billboard's Zeke Felton, sharing a joint with a Flower Moon groupie in a beaded caftan, Ted Munns from NME reading over his notes under the nearest floodlight, Lee Harmon of Cream trading stories with Time's Jim Faust. The Flower Moon groupie approached Curtis with the joint between her lips, eyeing the pass around his neck. It showed a picture of Curtis's face, which Keith Moon had once compared to a homeless man's Paddington Bear, printed above his name in the words Rolling Stone. The groupie offered Curtis the joint. He accepted it. His exhale became a brushstroke inside an impressionist painting. Swirls of smoke rose in the salty air, tan limbs and youthful faces interweaving like daisy chains across the meadow. He handed the joint back to the girl and watched her skip into a ring of hippies. Someone had a conga. Thrift store nymphs began dancing to an asynchronous rhythm. Curtis had cut his teeth as a correspondent on the festival circuit. Berkeley, Philly, Big Sur, Newport, none of them could touch Baleen Island for atmosphere. The hike up the red clay cliffs, the wildflower meadow, the view of the Atlantic Ocean. There was something magical about having to take a ferry to a show. As he watched the girls dance, Curtis felt a wave of premature nostalgia. There was a sense in the industry that folk was on its way out. The Vietnam War had been dragging on so long, the protest songs that had made Dylan and Baez what they were now felt emptied and tired. Curtis had come to hear what they'd all come to hear, Jesse Reed ushering in a new epoch for the dying genre. As if on cue, the dancing girls began to sing Reed's breakout single, their voices tremulous with excitement. My girl's got beads of red and yellow, her eyes are starry bright. Their feverish giggles recalled Curtis to a time a young Elvis Presley had played his high school in Gladewater, Texas, back in '55. 18-year-old Buddy Holly-obsessed Curtis had watched girls he'd known since kindergarten openly weep, swept away by the fantasy that Elvis might choose them. The full bye-bye birdie. That was the power of a true rock star. Soft-spoken Jesse Reed's persona couldn't have been more different from Elvis's, but Reed seemed to inspire the same devotion in his fans. He had the cowboy baritone of Chris Christopherson, but Reed sounded effortless, and the hysterical and the lyrical guitar skills of Paul Simon. Plus, he was taller than both, with blue eyes that, according to Curtis's guilty pleasure, Snitch magazine, were the color of medium stonewashed Levi's. She makes me feel so sweet and mellow, she makes me feel all right. Sweet and Mellow was a Snickers bar of a song. To hear it was to crave it. Hands down the hit of the summer, it had been holding in Billboard's top 10 for 18 weeks. Curtis had been tracking Reed since he opened for Fair Play at Wembley Stadium the previous year, but this single from Reed's self-titled album had turned him from fringe hero into mainstream sensation overnight. Tonight, Reed would take his place as the heir apparent to folk rock. The crowd broke into applause as a bald man with a gray beard shuffled on stage, Joe Maynard, the festival committee chair. The longer the audience clapped, the more pained Maynard looked. Curtis's news radar bristled. Yes, hello, my beautiful friends, he said. Maynard quieted the cheering with his hands. Well, there's no easy way to say this, so I'm just going to say it, he said. I'm afraid Jesse Reed won't be performing tonight. Curtis felt a stab of disappointment as his mental list of feature headlines turned to ash. A visceral shockwave passed through the crowd. One by one, dreamy expressions began to wilt, a field of dandelions turning white with anger, ready to blow. And then they did. Cries of outrage rang the twilight like a bell. The girls who had been singing and dancing a moment before collapsed into sobs. Maynard shrank behind the mic. But we've got a great act for you coming up next. It'll just be a few minutes now, he said, sweat gleaming at his temples. A second roar from the crowd buffeted him into the wings. Curtis edged towards the platform. Something must have just happened. He'd seen Reed's A&R man backstage after Curtis had interviewed Flower Moon. Maybe Reed had gotten too drunk to go on. Maybe he'd lost it backstage. The festival tonight was performance number 36 in a 60-arena global tour. Sometimes artists just cracked. Curtis had seen it before. He spied Mark Edison passing from the backstage area into the audience and caught his eye. Edison was a reporter for the Island Gazette, a local independent daily. Most of the fest's press corps found his snide antics insufferable, but he had always been useful to Curtis. The audience's initial dismay had given way to movement. Amidst cries from the most stalwart Reed fanatics, lines had begun to form through the crowd, pushing towards the exits. Edison reached Curtis. He offered Curtis his flask, warm gin. They both drank deeply. What's happening back there, said Curtis. Where's Reed? Edison shook his head. They stepped aside to let two girls thunder past, ripping up the Peace Love Jesse sign they carried like a banner. Curtis did not envy the band about to perform to this mob. What's going on, said Curtis. Someone from tomorrow's lineup? Mark shook his head. It's a local band, the Breakers, said Mark. I don't know them, said Curtis. What's their label? Label, Mark? I don't have one. They're just a bunch of kids. They were scheduled to play the amateur stage down the hill, and the committee just scooped them up. The biggest show they've ever played is 40, 50 people. Holy shit, said Curtis. This was going to be a train wreck. As he spoke, three young men began to set up on stage. They couldn't have been more than 20. The drummer looked the most filled out, with a chiseled jaw, shoulder-length black hair, and almond-toned skin. He and the bassist were clearly related. The bassist looked younger, hair shorn around his chin, a red bandana tied across his brow. The guitarist was paler, with boyish features and a somber manner. His sandy hair flopped in front of his eyes as he tuned. "We want Jessie!" a girl shrieked from over Curtis's shoulder. Curtis began to wonder if it wasn't better just to head back to town. The Elektra producers had rented a yacht and were hosting an after-party for industry folk. Baleen Island was only 5 miles from international waters, which meant good drugs. He could be flying within the hour. "Jessie Reed! Jessie Reed!" A chant rose up in the crowd among the faithful. As the boys checked their equipment, Curtis noticed a figure plugging into the amplifier behind the drum set. As she straightened up, the spotlight caught her yellow hair, which hung down to her waist like a bolt of golden silk. Her clothing was simple, jean cutoffs and a white peasant shirt, an acoustic guitar strapped across her back. Her tan legs looked girlish as she strode center stage, but she had a woman's features, full lips, hollow cheekbones. She glowed. "Who is that?" said Curtis. "Jane Quinn," said Mark, lead vocals and guitar. As she got into position, the boys instinctively inched towards her. Their feet pawed the ground like horses anxious at the starting gate. "We want Jessie!" a hysterical girl cried out. Jane Quinn stepped up to the mic. Curtis saw then that her feet were bare. "Wow," she said, flushed with excitement. "Quite a view from up here." The crowd ignored her. Those headed toward the exit continued to walk as if she wasn't there. A small contingent of Reed fans chanted his name like a descant over the din. "Jessie Reed! Jessie Reed!" Jane Quinn tried again. "Hi, everyone," said Jane. "We're the Breakers." This had no impact. The crowd continued to chatter as though they were in a parking lot rather than at a concert. On stage, the boys fidgeted in place. Jane exchanged a look with the guitarist. "Get off the stage!" a shrill voice cried above the chaos. Jane glanced toward the drummer as though about to count off. She faltered. Curtis felt a wave of pity. How was this slip of a girl supposed to compete with one of the world's biggest stars? "Jessie Reed! Jessie Reed!" Then Jane Quinn turned towards the crowd, squaring her shoulders. Her movements were slow and deliberate. She took a deep breath and placed a hand on the mic stand, closing her eyes. She stood perfectly still, listening. The crowd quieted half a decibel. When she opened her eyes, there was flint in her stare. She leaned towards the mic.
I'm so jealous of people who haven't read it to get to read it for the first time now.
I can angle myself. That's so kind of you to say. I feel like this very dramatic light happened in the middle of the reading. It's natural. There isn't like a man standing beside me with a flashlight right now. I'm going to see if I can angle myself a little bit away from it. All right. Nope. We'll just go with it.
It's very dramatic and striking. So I like it.
Only the best.
My first question for you is how the book started. Was it a character or a setting or an idea? Or given this particular book, I wondered if it was a song.
It was a song. It was probably a combination of a setting and a song. So I had this idea for this matriarchal family of women, and I really wanted to write about this strong female connection on an island. It was like total personal escapism. I was just thinking about, what would be great if I could just like pull a lever and be there. And then I was exploring the idea of sort of a contemporary story that was going to be a funeral plot. And I knew that there was going to be a musician in the family. And I had been sort of circling like James Taylor, Carly Simon, because I have a connection to Martha's Vineyard and they're such a presence there. And yeah, the more I researched them, the more I began to see that was a pretty interesting era, probably more interesting. The characters were more interesting than what I was coming up with on my own. And then I found out that James Taylor had written You Can Close Your Eyes about Joni Mitchell. And up until that point, I had thought he'd written it about Carly Simon. They were married for 10 years. The album that song came out on was Mudslide Slim and the Blue Horizon, which he released right around the time they started dating. And then because actually of an aside in Carly Simon's memoir, I realized that song had been written about Joni Mitchell, and that just totally blew my mind. And I became completely obsessed with that relationship, which is both like an open secret and something that there's very little about. And as I was sort of forensically mining through it, because, we're all so entitled to our celebrities. I'm so entitled to my celebrities. I wanted to know everything. And the best I could do is to start to make things up. So from there, the characters just kind of took over. And, Jane and Jesse in the book are different than James Taylor and Joni Mitchell. I think there's a physicality in common, but they were definitely initially inspired by that song, and then by the mutual inspiration that they provided for each other.
And so you've sort of already answered this by talking about the house of the hierarchy of women, or the house of three women. But one thing I love about the book is that there are so many characters and so many supporting characters, which is also something that you see, like, behind every singer-songwriter, there's a band, and there are band members, and they have families, and they have needs. So were there certain relationships between the characters that you wanted to explore, or did it all just sort of happen that you had to bring people on stage and then follow their backgrounds?
It kind of happened organically. Like, I, as I said, I'd sort of been rooting around this idea, and I'd written like 15,000 words of the other story. And then one day I had committed to doing this in my head, and it took me a while to sort of get in gear. And the most I could do was like, all right, I'm going to do a certain number of words a day. And one day I sat down and just started writing about the band. And it was a scene that's not in the book. It's the band at Mark Edison's office placing an ad because their singer quit. But these three bandmates completely popped out on their own. And at that point, I was like, I have to move this whole thing back in time. Like, this is what needs to happen now. So the band became ancillary. Like, I knew it was going to be this big romance, but they were actually the first characters that kind of came up for me, interestingly enough. And I think I don't know, I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by how these things come out of the ground. Like, clearly there was something in me that needed to feel this like really boyish energy in addition to writing these women. And then from there, they all just kind of moved copacetically. Like, I think part of what highlights how awesome Jane's family is, like, they're women to marriage, 7 generations, and they're completely financially independent. They support each other. They help each other raise kids. But then the boys react to them in such a positive way and are just like organically really helpful. And there's such an intense respect for Jane and for her family. Like, they all want to be allowed into this like shabby cottage that they live in and to be a part of their universe. So I think it all happened like at the same time. And I love what you said about like the sort of tertiary characters, because I kind of live for my minor characters. Like, I love Jane, like, wrings me dry, whereas like the people who come on for 1 or 2 scenes, like that's like where I get my juice when I'm like, doing the long haul.
So you said at one point it was clear to you that you had to go back in time and set the book in 1969. Was it harder or easier to write a book that's set in it historically?
What an awesome question. I think in certain ways it's easier, right? There are no cell phones, so there's no email. You have total control over certain kinds of communication and how people walk into a room. So there are certain mechanics, I think, that you get a total leg up on. And then it's my parents' time, so I had anecdotal knowledge of how things would sort of be. So I could accomplish like a basic draft on feel, but then I had to research every detail. It was the kind of thing where it's like, I knew at some point the channels shut off because I've been hearing about that my whole life, but I've never experienced it myself. So I ended up having to read about that and every other detail that went along with that time period. It didn't really feel like work, to be honest. Like, I was fascinated by it, and anything that would make the story better, I wanted to find and mine for. But yeah, I love not having to include technology in the story. So I think giving up letting email go is worth whatever research I had to do on the back end to make it more realistic.
Yeah, I think that you're either you're giving up something, but you're also gaining a lot by taking this very specific perspective. And you write like a music industry insider, very confident voice, lots of detail. And I wondered, does that confidence come from personal experience in the industry, or imagination, or research, or interviews, or something else?
I think it's a combination of having read a bunch of these biographies of these incredible female performers from the time, you get a lot of the antics just in your ear from their own accounts of it, and then knowing how it functions, how a media company functions, because my day job is as an editor. And there's a lot in common between the way that we publish books and how music used to be produced 50 years ago. We never made the jump to MTV or BTV as it should be in the book industry, but back in the day, the production cycle, the releases, all of the way that things were reviewed was really similar to the way we do it for books. So I was able to kind of use what I know of that and jump onto the bandwagon that way. And then there was a lot of just kind of logicking it through and following the money and being like, okay, even though these people are super evil, like what is their actual motivation and what is actually guiding this? And at the end of the day, it's almost always money, even if you're dealing with heinous producers, as Jane does. And that is ultimately like the truth that was kind of governing everything surrounding her in this book. So as long as I kept that in my view, even if it wasn't really in Jane's, I felt like I was able to navigate her in the right direction, or at least Willie too. Willie's her A&R man.
So Jane and Jesse fall in love in the book, and I thought it was very interesting that they're clearly not supposed to have a fairy tale romance. Their relationship is actually one of the main conflicts of the book. But it's clear that you love your characters very much. So was it hard to steer them away from a fairy tale romance?
Yeah, it was. I remember the day that I had to flip the switch. Like the way that I wrote this book, when I did the first draft, which is really when I found out what the story was. I had these note cards that I'd ripped up a piece of paper like that. I don't know why I was so cheap with myself in retrospect. Like that definitely says something about like how I viewed my own writing in comparison to like my day job. But I had these homemade note cards, and I would write out the next 10 scenes. Detailed. They were sort of like, this is what needs to be accomplished in this scene. And sometimes it was like a divulgence, and sometimes it was like a whole sequence. But I remember like the day that I wrote the scene that was like the note card was like flip the switch. And so there's a moment when they're on tour where Jane starts feeling very nervous around Jesse, and he starts going, like I talk about him as a polar bear who kind of ices her out. And that's the moment where it started to kind of have to go down the tubes. And I love how with writing and rewriting and editing, you get to go back to the beginning every time. And there's always a dread when I know certain things are coming. And there's always a dread when I get to a certain point in the book, without spoiling too much, where I know that point, like it's kind of like the last big thing. Whereas like the reader who's reading it for the first time will go on and think that something else might happen for several chapters. So that's always hard, but I felt like it was necessary, because the thing I wanted to accomplish more than their love story was like, what is the star matter that goes into an album like Songs in Ursa Major? And in order to do that, we had to start with Jane really high, and we had to take her really low. And so that it just had to happen. So as much as I loved her, I totally was willing to sacrifice her for her own good. But yeah, it was super.
We never stopped rooting for her. So it works in that way. So Jane and Jesse's relationship really caused me midway through the book to fall down the internet rabbit hole of James Taylor and Joni Mitchell and which song lyrics were written for each other. And you said that they were inspiration for the book, but were you trying to shine a spotlight on a certain aspect of their relationship, or just using it as a jumping off point?
It was really a jumping off point. Like I actually switched up a lot of the details. Like in reality, the real love stories, Joni was the one who was more established. JT was younger, and she kind of guided him through his first big album and that's when they parted company. So the reverse is actually the real story. And in my version, I wanted to figure out a way where I could keep Jane coming back for as long as possible. And the best way I could do that was to kind of invert those roles. But the thing about them that I thought was super fascinating, and the thing about their partnership that is so interesting to me, was just the idea of these seminal albums that are still beloved. Like yesterday, Blue had its 50th anniversary. It was the day that Spotify looked like my personal top 10 most played. And that all comes from this relationship that no one knows happened, and that is fascinating to me. Like the idea that something could inspire something so timeless was actually at the time just gossip fodder. Like the idea that like Brad and Angelina, can you imagine if Mr. and Mrs. Smith 50 years from now was regarded like Citizen Kane? Like it's just fascinating to me. Obviously, Blue has a lot more merit than Mr. and Mrs. Smith, but I just loved that it came from this like quite pulpy relationship. And I just wanted to, I don't know, it's so fascinating how we canonize art and how things like over time become great. Like F. Scott Fitzgerald was a pop artist in his day, and now every like 10th grader reads Gatsby. And I just wanted to like show what it really would have been like and go into the drama.
Well, I think that's the beauty of the book, is that you feel you're reading this sort of the insider knowledge of what, like when I was researching it, when I was scrolling through the internet, looking at it.
I love it.
I was reading, I was waiting for it to fall more in line with your book, because it gives you a feeling that you're reading something behind the scenes, and that's so cool. So the novel deals a lot with double standards in the music industry. And what specifically made you want to focus on that?
I think I just wanted to tell the truth about what would happen. And I knew that Jane and Jesse come from different class backgrounds. Like he's rich, she's poor. So that's like something that is like money is front and center for Jane from the minute you go into her head. And I wanted that to carry through. So I thought like the conversation about like nepotism versus like this myth of like pulling yourself up from your bootstraps, like that was something I wanted to explore through both of them. And then there's this really fascinating, not like neutralizing factor, but like numbing factor of their romance. Cause like they love each other so much. They're so fond of each other. And there's this mutual respect that even when Jane is like seething with jealousy that Jesse gets to be the headliner, even though he's further along, she's still happy for him. And then I wanted to see what would happen when she lost his protection. Like I was taken with the idea, and I've had experiences, and I've known a lot of women who have had experiences of being sort of like, for a simplified version, like the prom king's girlfriend, and then you lose that, you lose all your status, and just seeing like what would be left and how you carry on. Like I'm so interested in the dignity it takes to carry on when the thing that was giving you your place in society goes away. And I think part of why there's almost like an exaggerated emphasis on Jane's family is that I wanted to explore, I shouldn't say that, there's not an exaggerated emphasis on her family, but there's an exaggerated emphasis on the feminism around her family. I wanted to give Jane like a meaty, generations deep well of inner resources that she could draw on in the moment where like literally the whole world has abandoned her. And she like, this is something that I'm so fascinated by. Like at that time, the only people who were forced to watch their exes move on were celebrities. I think that was why Blue is sort of ahead of its time and still relevant today. Because now we all see notifications and get to like go crazy when we see our exes in pictures with other people. But back in the day, no one else had to deal with that. So I wanted to see how Jane would cope. And to me, like it was very, giving her the legacy of standing apart from society was one of the best ways I knew how to give her that like inner well of strength in order to get through everything.
Another theme of the novel is how much do you sacrifice for art, and how much is too much to sacrifice for your art. And it's really was interesting to me with Jane coming from this very long line of women who've sacrificed for art and for music in particular. Do you think that women are asked to sacrifice more for their art, either in the 60s or now?
I don't think they're asked.
They just
like,
do.
I think unless they're wary, like they're treated, they're welcomed, they're put through the machine, and they're disposed of. Like Joni writes about this actually in the album Between Blue and Court and Spark for the Roses. Like the title song in that is about female performers who are like essentially taken out behind and shot after the races, after they can't win anymore. And I think unless you were careful, like another reason I wanted to give Jane this background was because I wanted there to be a reason that she was wary enough to be precautious, because I think most people just jumped in. Like there's so many stories from that time of people who get record contracts and then find out after they become huge successes that they signed away like their life rights and their royalties. And I wanted there to be a reason that Jane wasn't completely vulnerable, because I think most of the time, like if you'd given me a record contract at 19, I would have blithely jumped in and never looked back. I would have been open about my relationship with Jesse, and then I never would have been able to recover. And I did want to give her the possibility of still standing on her own afterwards. So it all kind of works to create that opportunity, which I don't think most women are given. Like, I don't think there were like image consultants who would have sat down and been like, you really need to think through what this is going to do for your standing. Like, this is great now, but like, how will this affect your sophomore album? Like, I don't think there was the foresight for that. At the same time, I also think the industry was a lot more forgiving at that point. Like, it was sort of de rigueur that you would get one album just to get your name out there. And then your sophomore album was actually supposed to be your breakout. Like, they kind of threw the first album into the fodder. So Jane's actually weirdly on a more contemporary timeline for her own career, but Jessie is on like the equivalent of what would have happened back then, with like the first album to get your name out, the sophomore albums, like your blow up success, and then your third albums where you start to churn and have a base. Anyway, I'm getting far afield. I just love to talk about this.
I like hearing about it. It's really interesting. We have a couple questions from the audience. One is, what has been the most surprising aspect of publishing your debut novel? Was it something you never expected working in publishing?
What has been the most unexpected thing? I mean, there are actually tons of things that are very different from the author side that it reminds me a lot of getting married, actually. Like, you can go to a lot of weddings, but until you've actually been married and gone through it yourself, you have no idea. And it's sort of like that. Like, I have a very strong familiarity with the process. Like, I've published like hundreds of projects at this point. But yeah, nothing prepares you for the vulnerability. I'm trying to think if there's anything, like, I had a hard time with the cover. Like, as a visual editor, that was the part of it that I felt the most like protective over. And my publisher was really supportive in that process. But other than that, like, I feel like a lot of the surprises have been pleasant. Like, I have a lot of doomsday scenarios in my head. And so anytime something good happens, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so great. Like, Katherine wants to do an event with me. That's so great. I thought no one would want to do an event with me. So that's sort of where I come from on this. And then, yeah, I have had a million questions along the way. Oh, copy editing was a lot harder to be on this side of. I felt myself like taking it very personally at times.
I think everyone takes copy editing really personally, which is strange when it's like a necessary thing.
But
and do you feel more sympathy for your authors, or I should say more of a connection with them than you did before, now that you've been through it too?
Yeah, I mean, I've always fought pretty hard, but I fight really hard now. Like, if there's a situation where like the company wants something and the author wants something else, like I leave nothing on the table. Whereas like in the past, like I don't know. I think I just would have been like really diplomatic, and now I like can't sleep unless I've tried my hardest. So, and I don't want it to sound like I didn't try before, because I did, but it has become different. It is just like another level of empathy.
Somebody wants to know if you could make a playlist for the book.
Oh, yes, there is one. It's on Spotify. If you search songs in Ursa Major, you'll see JT in the little like thumbnail shot. That's the one. And yeah, it's sort of in order of the songs that I imitated in the book. So if you really want a guided experience, you can kind of try to figure out which one's which. And then, yeah, I also have a private one called Island Story, but I'm not going to release that until Carly Simon reveals all of the 3 names of who You're So Vain is written about. So,
Interesting.
It's a pact with Carly.
So another question is can you think of a modern pair of artists who have had a relationship whose art, as a result of that relationship, may seem less impactful or groundbreaking now, but maybe regarded more as the years go by? I guess
like, who do we
like
discuss now, but like in time we will come to view as like the new James and Joni. I mean, I'm sort of waiting to see which of Taylor Swift's bows becomes that one for her. Like, my personal favorite T Swift album is 1989, so that's the Harry Styles album, and he's still relevant, but we're only like 5 years away from that album's release. Actually, no, 7 years away from that album's release. So we've got some time to see how that stands. But I guess that would be my off the cuff response. Like, that would be where I would put my chips.
So a question I have for almost all authors is, how has the pandemic affected your writing?
It's been, actually, I feel bad saying that anything was beneficial from the pandemic, but it's been great because I work full time, and this has enabled me to balance a huge amount of work, both from my day job and then also from this, just because I am not in an office. So I can't, if I block out my day, I can find time that I wouldn't have had if I'd been going into work. And it's still, you still have to be present, you still have to check email, but if you're able to chunk things, like I've found it to be actually really beneficial. And then, like, creatively, it was really hard last year. I was fortunate enough to be in the position where like this one was grown, full grown. We just needed to prune it. So I wasn't needing to be generative. And a lot of the ideas I was coming up with last year were like big, fantastical, like horrifying stories, because that's how I was explaining the world to myself at that time. And I did feel like, I don't know how you felt. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Like, I felt like I was holding my breath to see like what kind of market we'd be writing for after the election last year. Like, there were just so many things that were up in the air. So I've definitely felt a lot more mojo this, I don't know, semester, half of the year. Like, 2021 has been freer once we got past the coup. But it's, I don't know, there have been good things and bad things. How has it been for you?
I really missed the stimulation of like day-to-day life. And I keep telling the story about how right before the pandemic started, I took one of our dogs to the dog park, and this man at the dog park gave his dog a 10-minute warning when it was time to go, not to be ironic or playful, and how that made me just like really happy and really want to write. So I'm sort of missing that interaction with random crazy people. But yeah, I can see why you wanted to sort of control it through a book narrative. I think a lot of authors felt like that. So you talked about blocking out time to write. What is your writing schedule when you're working on a project?
So I have like certain times of day that are like productive hours, and also have a limited number of productive hours. So I can usually get a good chunk done from like 11 to 1 is a good time for me. And then also like 4 to 6 is a good time for me. Then late at night, which I try really hard not to do because I am married and that's not nice. But we live in a small apartment. So but yeah, if I'm on a deadline, that's the other thing. I can pretty much work whenever. But if I had my druthers, like I would totally organize my days around those times. I can't always do that, but those are definitely the good times for me. How about you?
Well, supposedly everybody's most productive hours start 2 hours after you wake up and continues for 2 hours, supposedly. Sometimes I feel like I only get like 40 minutes of that. I feel like I have a notoriously short working day. So does writing, I thought of this when you were saying you're writing late at night, does writing energize you or exhaust you?
I also really love that question. I think it energizes me. Like I have a very like compartmentalized brain in this way, like writing, where I'm like, okay, play energizes me. Editing, where I'm going through all of my sentences and making them beautiful, is exhausting. And I feel rewarded afterwards, but that is what like makes my eyes feel like they're on fire. And then afterwards, I just want to sleep for 1,000 years.
Yeah. I don't think I could write late at night because I think my brain would be all sort of aerated and then I would have a hard time sleeping. I can write. I value my sleep very much. So when you're feeling stuck or maybe uninspired, are there certain writers that you go to feel inspired, or are there music that you listen to, I'm guessing, but also podcasts or TV shows, anything that you can depend on for inspiration?
That's such a good question. I'm very wary of inspiration as a concept, and I definitely feel it and have experienced it. But I'm like, as I said, like such a worrywart that I try to leave myself open to that, and at the same time, I'm like, you need to do this no matter what. So I'm a little bit of a taskmaster with myself in that way. And what's fascinating to me is that often the best things I write are things that are kind of done in that headspace where I'm like, I have no idea what I'm about to say, but I just have to go for it. Like, I know I have to write this Hannibal Fang party that I've never been to anything like this, and I have no idea. And I am an introvert and just want to sit at home and watch TV. And then like a great party comes out. I'm like, okay, I don't know where that came from, but like I forced myself off the cliff. And so I guess you can either argue that that's inspiration or just sort of like forcing yourself to put something on the page, and then you can always go back and make it better. So I feel pretty like confident in my ability to like make myself do that kind of thing. And then I also have this total distrust of my ability to assess what is coming out as I'm making it. Like, this is actually something that I picked up from my mom, who is an opera singer, but also like a really wonderful art philosopher. And she talks about this with her students all the time, how people hate their own voices and don't think they sound good. And then actually they sound perfect and did a great job. And oftentimes something where I'm feeling it really deeply and I'm like, this is so good. I reread it and I'm like, this is flat and terrible. And like all the feeling that I felt is not here. So it's fascinating to see like what actually happens on the page once you do it. And I guess to that end, I've had so many experiences where my flashes of inspiration have disappointed me that I'm now more open to just kind of like trying things and seeing what actually sticks. But what inspires me, I guess I have like pet shows that I love. Mostly I seek comfort. So I like TV series that have more than 3 seasons. I've watched a lot of people die in murder shows, mostly British people. I really like Midsummer Murders. and I listen to a lot of pop music, pretty much from every era. But when I listen to it, I'm often not really thinking about a scene. Like, that is sort of like a psychological rest for me, where I'm like, think about dancing, actually. Like, I used to dance when I was young, and so I'll like make up dances in my head, and that's like a rest for my brain. Sorry, I feel like that's a really like circumlocuted and non-specific answer to your question. Tell me yours.
I love the idea that you say you want comfort, because I think a lot of people, me included, they reread books and they rewatch television shows for the comfort. It's like comfort food. You know it's going to taste a certain way. You know it's going to make you feel good. There's not going to be surprises. And I think that for a lot of artists, when they're working, they need that comfort. And so we seek it out in, the form of ER reruns. So yeah, I think it's interesting that you do dance steps and that your mother is an opera singer and has sort of guided you with her philosophy. That's very cool. I don't usually ask people about writer's block, because that's such a terrible, terrible subject. But have you ever had reader's block, where just nothing could hold your attention?
Last year was like that for me, pretty much the whole year. Like, if I needed to, it was similar to the writing. Like, if I needed to do something for a task or like to look something up, then I could absorb myself in it. And work was that way for me. Like, I can always read my author's work, and there's like a deadline component to that. But yeah, last year was like a dry well. I had such a hard time concentrating on anything. And there are months where I just don't even know what I consumed. Like, at one point, I did read Midnight Sun, the follow-up to the Twilight Saga, and then watched all of the movies, and I can't remember any of it. It was right before the election. So I've definitely had reader's block, and I try to be gentle with myself in those moments and just be like, it would be better for you to read something. So if you would like to read like a period romance, like, you should do that. Like, it's better than like whatever trash TV you're going to watch. And then sometimes I just watch trash TV because I'm really not a perfect person. But yeah, I definitely have experienced a reader's block. How about you?
Yeah. During the actual lockdown part of the pandemic, I could only read Little House on the Prairie. I read the whole series and I was like, this is my speed now. This is me at this moment, is Little House on the Prairie. Although I read it basically every year anyway, so it wasn't that different.
You read Farm Boy?
Sorry, what did you say?
You read Farm Boy, the one about her husband?
No, I always skip that one.
Okay, I didn't make it all the way through, but I was curious if you read it. There's like a scene where a potato explodes on a fire, and I think about that all the time. I don't know why. But yeah, but the other ones are good too, that are about Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Yeah, I think about Ma's life a lot, and also how did she keep from murdering Pa? Like, that was a hard life to live, like moving all the time and having small children. I don't know. I think of it from like Ma's point of view a lot. And I read that a lot of people during the beginning of the panic, especially, were reading The Stand by Stephen King, and that it was a weirdly comforting thing for people to put a narrative, even though it's such a dark narrative, to the events of a pandemic. I thought that was really interesting, that was what people reached for in their, for sort of reader's block.
That is fascinating.
So let me think for a minute. Well, so what are you reading right now?
Right now, I'm actually reading your book, Early Riser, which is one of my recommendations. Yeah. So good. Okay, so I'm gonna gush. I've been a fan of yours since Single Carefree Mellow. I love that collection. I know exactly where I was when I read every single one of the stories. So amazing. He just like captures so many relationship dynamics so well. And then I have been waiting to read this book as a reward for like a big project, and I'm so thrilled with it. First of all, this is kind of a corny thing today, but it's fun to have a twin like Jane. Like apparently, like that's our name. So the main character's name is Jane. She's amazing, the funniest woman, and she is a second grade teacher and just falls in love with this man Duncan, and I don't know. It's the most beautiful story. I'm at the part right now where she's pregnant. It's at Christmas, so I just read the Christmas scene where she's decorating the tree and overhearing the conversation. And everyone should read this book. It is so moving and funny, and the tone is just like a fighter pilot. Like it's stealthy, and you don't see these suspenseful moments coming, and then they do, and you're just like, I didn't sign up for a thriller, but I need to know what happened. And then I don't know, it's amazing. It's an amazing book. So everybody, don't buy my book, buy Early Morning Riser, or buy both.
Nobody's ever told me a fighter pilot before.
I really wanted to be original for you. So,
tell me what else you're reading or what you've read recently that you really liked.
Okay, so I was very late to the party on Mexican Gothic, and that book blew my mind. I absolutely loved it. Silvia Moreno Garcia is a sci-fi writer, and she's branched into these sort of like period drama mysteries, but they still have like a little bit of sci-fi. I mean, this book has a lot of sci-fi horror in it. It's a slow burn. The characters are super dynamic. It's an amazing setting. They tackle tons of wonderful themes, but it's not the point. I mean, the story is the story. So you get to like contemplate some heavy things over here while you're like gripped by this narrative. It's amazing. She has a new book coming out August 17th, Velvet Was the Night. It's also a 70s book. So if you like my book and you're like into that time period, highly recommend that. And then there's this book that my colleague Jean edited, A Touch of Jen. I wrote down the on sale dates. That's why I'm clicking over here, you guys. It's by this woman, Beth Morgan. It's out July 13th. This book is fascinating. So it's a literary novel. It's about this couple that are obsessed with this woman, Jen, who's a social media influencer, and they end up going on vacation with her. And then it also spins into horror. And it's just like, it's one of the weirdest books I've ever read, and also one of the best. And I can't wait for everyone to read this so that I can talk about it with you and them. So those are probably my three at the moment.
What was the last one? What was the title?
Touch of Jen.
Touch of Jen. Oh, I really want to read it.
Oh my God. I feel like you would like it, reading this and your other work. Sorry, swatting my computer, my passion over books. The cover is fascinating. It's this like millennial pink image of this woman who's like Samaral, like crawling over the cover, but you can see like the peach of her butt. It's so good. So yeah, Touch of Jen, Beth Morgan. So good.
We'll check it out.
Yeah.
Well, I love that you mentioned Silvia Moreno Garcia. Mexican Gothic is like a Books and Books staff rec, and I actually finished Velvet Was the Night a couple weeks ago.
You got
so
it.
Good.
Oh my God.
I'm Hispanic, and it takes place in Mexico City, and it's great. I'll give you the last line of her afterward. My novel is pulp noir fiction, but it's about a real horror story. So it's fantastic. I can't recommend it.
God. Okay, I'm ready. That's amazing.
Well, to close out, Catherine, I'd love to hear what you're reading too.
Well, we were talking just before it started that I read Brood, and I just loved it, but I can't remember the author's name. And I just read The Night She Disappeared by Lisa Jewell. I read the arc of that, and it was funny because, she's like this very famous suspense writer, and I'm reading it thinking like, wow, she's really good at suspense. And that was really it was fascinating. I just sort of lived in the book for like 3 days.
Well, those are all fantastic book recs, and I'm sure we're all adding them to our TBR right now. But I just want to say thank you so much, Emma. Thank you, Catherine. This was such a great conversation. And I'm going to go look up that playlist. I can't wait to look at your songs. And then thank you to everyone in the audience. If you guys haven't ordered songs in Ursa Major, you can do so by clicking the green button. And as I mentioned earlier, that leads to our shop site, and you can order any of Catherine's books there as well. So thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you guys at our virtual events in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye, guys.